When you grow up in a small town in Nebraska, there isn't really much for you to do to pass the time, especially as you begin to enter your teen years and your adolescence. I remember for a while, there was this period of time where all my friends, as well as myself, would spend a lot of time walking through the local cemetery to pass the time. I know it might sound strange, but we didn't really have any parks to hang out in or an arcade or anything like that, so that the graveyard essentially became our park. I mean, we always kept it respectful and never did anything to dishonor the memories of those who were laid to rest there, but we would often take strolls through it and around it just talking. Some summer nights we would end up staying there for a while well after dark, and those nights were always the best because they would always end up with us telling each other about spooky things that we heard about, like urban legends and the sort. So it gave us all a bit of an adrenaline rush, and we honestly freak us out to the point where we would have to leave the graveyard because it was just too uncomfortable. One night though, I'll never forget. It's probably the most terrifying thing that ever happened to me, and to this day, I'm still certain it was just one of our friends messing with us. But it was one of those days where we ended up hanging out in the cemetery for hours, just walking around and talking about what we were going to do later on that year. And as usual, once the sun went down and the world around us fell silent, my friend Andrea began telling us about this new story she had heard about online. It wasn't anything we hadn't heard of before, a new internet urban legend like Slender Man or the Rake, but as you know, even the most overplayed story can be scary in the right setting. So I'll be honest, at least for myself personally, I can say that even what happened next hadn't happened, I would have likely caved and asked everyone if we could leave anyway. Gladly, I was spared from that shame, but sadly, it was for a much more horrifying reason. As Andrea continued with her story, all of us who had been gathered around in a sort of semicircle around Andrea was listening intently. We loved this sort of thing. That is until things got too serious. As Andrea was talking, out of nowhere, a voice called out from behind us. All of us stood up straight, tense with fear as what sounded like a child began talking to us. "That's a scary story," it said. Silence fell over the entire group as we all looked at each other with our eyes wide open. The silence was finally broken as a couple of us tried to laugh it off. I asked the group which one of them did it because I thought it was just genius. We all eagerly waited for someone to own up to such a devious prank, but before anyone could respond, we heard the voice again. "Have you seen my family?" the child asked from the darkness. We tried our best to look for him, without moving of course, but none of us could see anything beyond the gravestones. So we just assumed he must have been shy or possibly even scared and hiding. That was when my buddy Mikey stepped forward a bit and asked the child, wherever it was, if he or she had lost their family. He asked how long the child had been out there and tried to assure them that it was okay to come out. We only wanted to help. That was when the energy around us seemed to change. All of a sudden there was a huge amount of tension in the air. There was no response from the child. As we waited for a response, we began searching around our backpacks for a flashlight. And once we had one, we began shining it around and to look for the lost child. But there was no one in sight. Every second that passed, I think every one of us was feeling more and more fearful of our situation. There was no way to explain this random child that was nowhere to be seen. We all decided that it would probably be best to leave for the night, so we packed everything that we had up and began heading toward the cemetery exit. Just as we were getting to the gate of the cemetery, Mikey and I decided to take one last look back at the graves behind us, but I don't think either of us was expecting to see it. As the flashlight hit the path between the stones, Mike and I both saw what looked like a young boy's head poking out from behind a headstone. We jumped back in fear, but then called out for the child. As we ran to the spot where we saw him, We were shocked to see that no one was there. It was then that we decided to rush out of the cemetery and not look back. We called the police to let them know about the child, but I'm fairly certain they thought we were just playing a prank on them. And frankly, I don't blame them. As I said, I still think it might have been an elaborate prank by one of my friends. All I know is we don't go into cemeteries anymore. I never thought anything could make me not want to visit my sister, but after what happened in the cemetery, it's hard to go by myself. My older sister passed away about 6 years ago now, but for the first 3 years, I would find myself visiting the graveyard just to sit and talk to her every now and then. It would often be at random times, and sometimes on special occasions, but the last time I went to visit her happened to be one of the random times. I was on my way home from work, and it was around 8 that night. Being the middle of November, it was already pretty dark out, but having a tough day at work, I really wanted to stop by the cemetery. It had just snowed, but thankfully the parking lot had been plowed, so I was able to pull up close to the gate. I began walking through the cemetery, heading directly toward my sister's grave, with the snow crunching beneath my feet. As I began to pass more and more rows of headstones, though, I began to notice something. There appeared to be the same form of glass jar placed on the top of almost every headstone. I was really curious about this, but it was cold, so I figured I should just go to my sister's grave and say my piece before heading back to the car. To my surprise, however, one of those jars happened to be on my sister's headstone, so naturally, as soon as I got close enough, I picked it up, I pulled my phone out and turned on the flashlight to see inside the jar. I'm glad that jar didn't end up shattering after I dropped it because I was in shock. As soon as my phone light hit the jar, I could clearly see a human kidney that had been suspended in some sort of substance floating inside. I stumbled back from my sister's gravesite and looked around me. I rushed over to another jar that was nearby and looked inside, and to my horror, I found another organ. I think it was someone's liver. It started to become harder and harder to catch my breath as I tried to calm myself down. I knew that I needed to call the police, but just as I pulled my phone out, I heard a sound that I never thought would scare me so much, coming from further in the graveyard but surely heading my direction. I heard the sound of snow crunching underneath someone's footsteps. Whoever left the jars on the graves were still in the cemetery with me. I quickly turned and started running as fast as I could back to the entrance of the cemetery, and as I ran, I could hear the sound of the footsteps behind me getting louder and louder. Thankfully, I made it to my car before whoever it was could catch up to me. I pulled out of the parking lot as fast as I could and began calling the police from my car's Bluetooth. I told the operator about what I had seen and then promised them I would wait at a nearby gas station to give an officer my official statement. Afterward, I was sent home by the officer only to be called in for a follow-up statement the next day. According to the police, the officer went back to the graveyard and found the jars that I told them about. It wasn't clear at the time, but it was presumed that the jars contained organs from at least 4 different people. No one really knew what to make of the situation. All anyone knew was that I most likely escaped the wrath of a serial killer that night. In my hometown, there was this old cemetery that no one had been buried in since the mid-1800s, and at this point, it was hardly even maintained. The grass was almost always overgrown, and most of the headstones were all dirtied up from the weather. It wasn't a place you would typically saw people spending their time. It was more of just a spot on the side of the road that you might point out as you were passing by. Sort of like, look at that, but nothing really special. Now, if you grew up in the area, there was a good chance that at some point in your life, someone would have tried to convince you that during the evening hours, evil spirits could be seen wandering the grounds. This was obviously nonsense, but it was an urban legend that had been around since I was a child, and probably even longer. One day though, after the topic got brought up during class on a Friday afternoon, Two friends of mine, as well as myself, decided to go and hang out in the cemetery to see if we could see anything happen. Of course, nothing otherworldly happened that night, but in a way something far more terrifying did. It wasn't until after we all had eaten dinner that night that we all ended up meeting at a local convenience store. The store was only about a mile from the cemetery, and it was right next door to my friend Sean's house. Brian had taken the bus to Sean's house, so the two just met me at the convenience store, where they hopped in my car and we headed to the cemetery. We were there for about 25 to 30 minutes, and there had been no sign of strange activity, but we decided earlier that we would stay for at least 2 hours to check it out, so we just continued walking around and checking out the old headstones. The entire time we were there, we had been talking, but we did our best to keep our voices down in case we heard anything. And I'm thankful that we did, because after a while of being in the graveyard, we all heard the sound of someone walking around ahead of us. We stopped in our tracks and all looked at each other to make sure that we all heard that. The sound of someone walking on the dead grass was now more distinct, almost as if it was walking toward us. That was when Brian decided to speak up. "Hello? Is someone there?" he asked. Chills ran down my back as what sounded like a grown man answered, "Why are you kids in the graveyard right now?" That was when I tried to explain that we were just hanging out for a little bit and getting fresh air. The sound of footsteps stopped. "Do I know you?" the man asked. We all shook our heads as we said no, but he didn't seem to believe us. "Yeah, I'm sure I know you from somewhere. Come a little closer, would you?" Without even thinking about it, I responded, "No man, we really should be getting out of here." I tapped my friends on the arms and we slowly began walking backward. "Hey, where are you going?" the man asked. We didn't know how to answer him, so we just kept backing up. But that was when we heard him start to advance toward us. We didn't waste any time. The three of us turned and began sprinting toward my car. We could hear him yelling from behind us, "Hey, get back here." We all made it back to my car and hopped into it as fast as we could. I put the key in the ignition, and as the headlight turned on, we could see a tall man on the larger side of the weight scale who was shielding his eyes from the light. In his right hand, we could clearly see a hammer of sorts. I tossed the car into reverse and got out of there as fast as I could. We filed a police report. But other than going and checking out the cemetery, there wasn't much that the officers could do for us that night. All we could do was be thankful that we got away.